Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Jim Schachter, the President and CEO of New Hampshire Public Radio. Thank you so much for ending a beautiful, warm winter day, at least here in Concord, New Hampshire, by spending an hour or so with us on this very, very special Zoom. NHPR's document team and the project that Jason and Peter will be discussing with you tonight, Death Resulting, represent the depth of New Hampshire Public Radio's commitment to independent, trustworthy local journalism. The document team, which consists of Jason, reporter Lauren Chulgin, and the editor we've just hired to lead the group, Katie Culinari, who's joining us from her position as Deputy News Director at WHYY in Philadelphia. The team produces what's called accountability journalism. Its investigations deeply examine systems and institutions, holding those who have power and authority in our society and in our state to account. The stories that Jason and Lauren report are chosen to resonate not just here in New Hampshire, but across America. And they aim to give you the information you need to make informed choices about critical issues, and then to use your civic superpowers to take a stand and make a difference in your community. At NHPR, we operate on the premise that fearless, fact-based reporting helps build stronger communities, and that it's more important than ever at a time when malign forces and misinformation are tearing our communities apart. Now, because you're here with us tonight, I suspect you share our belief in the value of independent, community-centered journalism. If so, please take a moment this evening. Peter and Jason won't mind, I promise you, to go online to nhpr.org/support and make a gift now. Accountability reporting isn't cheap. I'm sure Jason will give us a sense of the complexities of projects like Death Resulting. If you become a sustaining member of NHPR tonight, though, at whatever level of monthly giving works for you, your support will be matched dollar for a full year. That's true if you increase your sustaining contribution or renew a monthly gift that's lapsed. Your gift at nhpr.org/support will be doubled. Plus, anyone who becomes a sustainer at $5 per month or more gets a 12-ounce bag of coffee from A&E Coffee Roasters, who've been brewing locally here in New Hampshire since 2001. You see, you just can't lose tonight. We appreciate each of you so much for your interest in our work. So let's get to it. It's time to turn the program over to the host of All Things Considered on NHPR every weekday afternoon, my colleague, Peter Biello.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thanks to you, Jason, for being a part of this program tonight. The reporting is magnificent. And if our viewers haven't heard this latest season yet, hopefully they'll dive right into it shortly after this broadcast to hear how you've woven this story together. So Jason, thank you so much.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Peter.
You've got a lot of fans who may remember your work on Bear Brook. And for the folks who maybe haven't had a chance to enjoy this latest season of Document, tell us about Death Resulting. What's it about? Spell it out for us.
Yeah, it's about just that. Death resulting is a sort of shorthand for a kind of criminal charge that can be brought if you supply drugs that someone fatally overdoses from. So, Peter, if you and I were sharing drugs together and I gave you the drugs and you died of an overdose, I could be held legally responsible for your death under these so-called death resulting laws. And those laws and the discretion in which they get used or not get used, to me, opened up all kinds of really fascinating questions that apply across sort of all drug policy and drug law enforcement that are questions I thought that were worth asking and worth poking around for an answer in.
We're going to dive into some of those questions, I'm sure. I should let our viewers know that you can ask a question right now and at any point during this broadcast. So if anything occurs to you that you'd like to hear more information about, or if you have a question that's been lingering in your mind since you've finished listening to Death Resulting, use the Q&A button at the bottom of this screen. It's right at the bottom there. Just click there, type your question, and we'll bring your question in as soon as we can, or in the moment that it's relevant. So yeah, thanks in advance for that. Really appreciate your questions. So death resulting. Okay. So many questions surrounding this particular law, many iterations of it. Can you tell us what inspired you to pursue this among all the possible story ideas you could have pursued? What made you want to pursue this one?
Yeah, we got an email from Josh's attorney. So as many will know, the story follows Joshua Cook, a young man from New Hampshire who was charged with death resulting for selling or sharing some drugs with a friend of his, who then fatally overdosed on them. And we got this long email, the kind that we don't normally get, from a defense attorney who was charged with defending Josh against that charge. And I had heard of these kinds of cases before, and I thought they were interesting. And this here was a chance to kind of follow it in real time and see what happened in this case. And I thought, also the particulars of Josh's case and what he was facing, and his background that he brought into it. 20 years old, addicted to drugs himself. A pretty rough childhood is probably an extreme understatement for Josh's experience growing up. And so, yeah, from that first email, we started to reach out to folks and to kind of, as we will often do, kind of scout the story to see if there was potential there for, a longer series. A lot of things that we think will be great ideas don't really pan out once we start poking around in them. But with this story, once I talked to Josh's mom, I think that's when I, at least personally, decided that it was a story worth pursuing. And for those who listen, I think you'll get a sense for why. And we can talk more about her later.
Tell us, well, yeah, since you've mentioned her now, I'd love to hear now, like,
Sure.
What was it about Josh's mom that tipped the scales in favor of making this not just like a one-off story, but a 4-part series?
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, I think these cases, they kind of they're a kind of shorthand for big questions about like all kinds of drug cases and our drug policy, and is this the way we should be handling or trying to address problem drug use in America, right? And you could ask these kind of questions about, like, should we punish people? Is incarceration working? Is the law enforcement approach in general the right idea? You could ask that about a simple drug possession case. But in a death resulting, the stakes are so high for a defendant, but also the conduct that's resulted in there has led to such a serious result as well. Someone has died here. It could not be more serious, sort of on either end of the spectrum. And so the law in these kinds of cases open up all those kinds of questions. But I also thought with this case, once I met Josh's mom, it also opens up all kinds of avenues for exploring those, because one of the main questions is, who's responsible, right? That's kind of what these laws are trying to do, is assign responsibility for, drug overdose death, right? And in the framework of these laws, it's pretty simple. It's whoever handed that person the drugs, right? There's obviously a lot of other ways to look at it. And with Josh's story, because we had Shannon, who was so generous and open and willing to share her history and Josh's history, it opened up a way to look at that question of who's responsible in a way that went back in time. So you had this breadth of questions we could ask with this case and this law. We also had a single way to go into the inquiry that could take us back in time and look at the kind of these kind of bigger forces that were at work, and whether it's generational poverty, generational addiction, kind of failed interventions by the system, by the state over decades and decades to try to stop all of this, and having such a kind of vivid and forthright witnesses to that in both Josh and his mom was, to me, once we had kind of both of those voices, I felt like we could really tell a story. Because it's one thing to want to talk about these sort of issues and this topic and this policy, but if you don't have characters who are living or have experienced these things firsthand, then it's hard to tell a compelling narrative out of that. And that is ultimately what we want to do on this team, is tell a narrative that gets people to care about all those issues and topics and policies and those sorts of things. So that's a long answer, but I think that's about as best I can put it right now.
Well, no one disputed in the story that Josh gave his friend the drugs that killed her. It's the question of responsibility, and we'll hash that out a little more. You also report here that death resulting laws really took effect in the 1980s. Now, you mentioned, the scenario of friends giving friends drugs and when one of the friends dying and the other being responsible for that. When these laws were passed in the 1980s, is that the scenario that lawmakers had in mind, or did they imagine sort of nefarious drug dealers who weren't themselves users making conscious decisions to put people at risk? Or was it maybe both, or maybe lawmakers didn't care? What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'd say probably both, depending on the lawmaker, at the time, to be honest. I think by and large, the sense was that, we're talking about the 1980s when death resulting law was the federal death resulting law was passed, which then a lot of states copied in the following years. It was the height of the crack panic and the sort of general drug anxiety across the U.S. And there's no way to kind of disentangle that from the racist sort of undertones of that national anxiety and the way that it was kind of trafficked in and used as a political force, a political tool. And so, yeah, it wasn't one of the things that I was most interested to learn or surprised by when I dug back into the history of the passage of that law was how little, if at all, the actual death resulting statute was debated within because it was a part of this huge 1986 anti-drug abuse bill.
So it was one small part of that.
Exactly. And as far as I was not able to find any evidence that it was specifically debated on its own merits. And it's understandable why, because it was just sort of an enhancement of penalties under things that were already illegal. Just distributing drugs was already an illegal act. Now they were going to add an enhancement to it that if you did this thing and it resulted in death, then your penalties would go way up, which is a common kind of legal mechanism in other kinds of, criminal statutes. If you drive your car while you're drunk, it's a crime. But if you do it while you're drunk and you kill someone, the penalties you face will be higher. And it's the same, in all kinds of criminal statutes. So it's sort of understandable in a way, like why it wasn't, singled out, and add to that the kind of swift pace with which they were passing this, trying to do it in time for the elections. And it just wasn't really, as far as we were able to tell, really debated or talked about. But I think the general idea, it was one that was like, drug dealers are preying on the community. Like, how do we fight back? It was a war, right? It was a war on drugs. How do we fight back? And that was the kind of language, and to some extent still is. And as with many policies, both drug policies and not, there's not a lot of the nuance got lost, and there was not a lot of lip service given to, it's complicated. There are different scenarios in with which people receive drugs, and maybe sometimes it is a nefarious, like, kind of villain, like pushing drugs on the street corner to kids who would never have otherwise taken them. Okay, that's sort of a caricature. But there's also, if that's on one end, the other end of the spectrum is, two friends who are hanging out, and one is in agony because they're dope sick, because they're in withdrawal, and the other friend has drugs and they want to help their friend, and so they give them drugs. and there's everything in between. And sometimes those things overlap. It gets very complicated, but I guess is no surprise that that's level of nuance and detail wasn't, like debated on the Senate floor.
Mhm.
But here we are living with that, those choices back then, all up to the present, with sort of other layers of discretion in the system that have brought these laws back into use more frequently.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about the inspiration for this law. I'm not a follower of basketball, so I'd never heard of Len Bias. Can you tell us a little bit about Len Bias and what happened to him? And
Yeah, Len Bias was a star basketball player at the University of Maryland, and he was drafted by the Boston Celtics, and was, by all accounts, set to become one of the great players in the NBA in 1986, I believe. And I believe it was the night after he was drafted by the Celtics, he died of a cocaine overdose. And Len Bias's death is sort of in the midst of and in the context of the already kind of burgeoning panic around cocaine and especially crack in the US, just sort of supercharged that debate. And many scholars who study this will now say that Len Bias's death was kind of the catalyst for the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which introduced the death resulting law. And even in some states that now have their own versions of death resulting laws, they get referred to as Len Bias laws. As it was like, this is a law designed to punish people, or to prevent what happened to Len. We're gonna throw the book at drug dealers because we can't have this happening to sort of young American heroes like Len Bias. That was the kind of message that was kind of bandied around after his death.
Mhm. So that was 1986, and here in the present day, people are still being charged with death resulting. People like Josh. I was really fascinated with your conversations, or your conversation with the prosecutor early in the episode, and what he thought about death resulting laws and the science of addiction and how it changes one's ability to control their actions or make smart decisions. What do you think when you think about that interview with the prosecutor and prosecutors in general and their approach towards this?
Yeah, prosecutors are really the other kind of main actors in this whole system, right? We just kind of talked about the way the legislature, created these laws in a kind of haste and an atmosphere. And now, the people with the most power in these situations are the prosecutors, because they can decide whether or not they're going to charge someone with this law, which is a huge power, and is can be like utterly life-changing for people. Which crime they're going to be charged with, how many crimes they're going to be charged with, what kind of plea offers they're given, right? So one of the interesting things we found was that through some research at Northeastern University, that while the death resulting law was passed in the 80s, it seemingly was hardly ever used until about 10 or so years ago, as overdose from opioids really started to rise. As we know all too well here in New Hampshire, and prosecutors sort of looked around and found this kind of old tool that wasn't really being used that often, and said, oh, here's a way to respond to these overdose deaths. And so John Farley, who is the acting U.S. attorney in New Hampshire, was one of those prosecutors, like others across the country, who kind of joined in that movement to sort of use these death resulting laws as to combat fentanyl and this surge in overdose deaths. And when I spoke to him, he kind of attributed the rise in the use of those prosecutions as just being related to the rise in deaths. More deaths, more opportunities to charge death resulting. But I think for John, it wasn't really a question of was this was this working as a kind of public policy matter? Like, it is charging death resulting cases, is it stopping the is it stemming the flow of fentanyl into the state? Is it keeping people alive who would otherwise be dead of an overdose? He seemed less interested in those questions, because I think from his perspective, those questions are for the legislature, and I'm the prosecutor, and I prosecute the laws as they're written by the people who got elected by voters. And so,
but that seemed strange to me. Like, he didn't have any feelings whatsoever about what he was asked to do at his job. I mean, that was the response I had when I was listening. I was like, come on, you have a more comprehensive feeling about this than that. But of course, when a reporter's microphone is in front of you.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm sure he was right. Not eager to necessarily share it with me on tape. I will say that John Farley, didn't challenge or refute any of the kind of underlying arguments for critiques of death resulting laws. He was happy to say that look, these are challenging questions, and people will come to different opinions about what's the right thing to do. But he really felt that that there was value in a deterrence effect with these laws, although there is research from his own agency that would undermine that. And that on a more kind of philosophical level, that there has to be some kind of accountability when someone dies because of someone else's actions. And that's the kind of, to me, that's the kind of really interesting territory that the story gets into. And one of the reasons I wanted to do it was because that's a really interesting and challenging question to try to answer, and can be applied to so many situations where someone is in active addiction and doing things that might be harmful to someone else. To what extent are we willing to kind of abandon any concept that of personal responsibility for those people? And it can be easy to say that, but it's another thing in a situation where you have real victims and the consequences are so clear and vivid, that I think John kind of voiced that side of the argument. That's like, we can't just do nothing. We can't just say, like, because I think he would equate that as a kind of devaluing of the victim's life in this case. And obviously that you could debate that on its own. But so yeah, anyway, I thought it was an interesting conversation with John, and I was pleasantly surprised that they were willing to grant an interview to us for the story. The U.S. Attorney's Office is not known for being open and eager to speak about their cases, especially, well, he did wait till it was over, but they wouldn't talk while it was ongoing. But it's not always that you can get a U.S. attorney to sit down with you and talk about their work.
Viewers, just want to remind you that you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question whenever it occurs to you, and we'll try and put your question to Jason as soon as possible. We get this question from Patricia. It may be rhetorical at this point, but the question was, assuming the legitimate intent was to deter drug use and sale, do you find evidence that those most affected by drug use are actually aware of the various penalty enhancement? It would seem that the very reality of addiction would tend to obliterate those considerations in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And one many advocates would raise, even the Department of Justice's own research on deterrence. To my knowledge, it wasn't about drug offenders or drug crimes in particular, but part of their research showed that what does not work as deterrence is longer sentences for crimes, and broadcasting the fact that if you do this, you're going to get 30 years. What does provide deterrence, according to the DOJ research, is that an increased sense that you'll get caught. So it's not really about the sentencing or the penalty that you would face. It's a perception that you're more likely to get caught, or that you're more likely than not to get caught doing it, is actually an effective deterrent. So yeah, I think it's kind of a fanciful notion that someone like in Josh's position, at 20 years old, being homeless, just out of the youth detention center, just out of adult prison, was had any idea, as I put it to John Farley, that he wasn't reading the press releases from his office about death resulting cases. And that raises another kind of set of questions about, well, who are those press releases for then? And what is this language about, holding people, sending a message, right? That's the kind of the most common phrase you hear about these prosecutions. It sends a message to people that we're not going to stand for this kind of thing anymore. John might argue that there are, drug traffickers who are paying attention and it is deterring them. But I think when you look at the majority of drug transactions, they're happening at a very low level. People like Josh, and I think it's quite a stretch to believe that Josh was aware, that this was a penalty that he could face or any kind of thing like that.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Please do keep them coming. We have this question from Peg and Peter. Are you aware of laws and punishments in other countries regarding death resulting and how addiction is handled or not? Is that something you looked at or considered?
No, we didn't focus on that specifically as a question in this story, but it's a good one. I'd be curious to learn myself if there's a different penalty for drug transactions resulting in death in other countries, or if this is a uniquely American thing. It's a good question.
You in your reporting here, you talked to a man whose daughter died of an overdose, and in her circumstance, she took a pill that had fentanyl in it, but it was determined that she didn't know there was fentanyl in it. And fentanyl is so powerful that if you think you're taking something much weaker, fentanyl will kill you. It's very strong. Is there space in the law to distinguish between drug dealers who deceive, who give you something, but it's really something else, and people like Josh and Liz, where they were both seemingly aware of what they were taking and everything was, they were in the throes of addiction, but they consented. Is there any distinction made by that in the law, or is that come at the sentencing part of things? What do you think?
Well, there's nothing written into the law itself that would just make a distinction there, but this is exactly the kind of situation where prosecutorial misconduct comes into play. A prosecutor can use that difference in facts that you just laid out and decide in one case, this guy, was dealing, maybe, I don't know if this is true in that case, but let's say, this person had sold drugs and someone died of an overdose, and then he went on to sell the same batch to another person and they died of, you could build an argument that he or she had knowledge in that. And maybe that would make you more likely to want to bring this charge. So, it's an interesting question, because this is kind of where the kind of double-edged sword of discretion, I guess, is a way to think about it in the system, where you might say, well, we want discretion so we can distinguish between those two places, but this is also where discretion doesn't always break the way you think it should break, right? Discretion is discretion for the people in power, for those prosecutors. And so it's there, it can be used, but it doesn't have to be. And because we're not really tracking as a country or a judicial system, or as prosecutors, we're not really tracking how and when and why we're using death resulting laws. There's no real way to know if those discretionary choices are all breaking in the same direction. And in fact, what we do know from Northeastern's research is that that discretion is going against people of color, for instance. So a lot of questions there that I would love to have been able to get better answers to with regard to that kind of discretion. But
this might be a good time to bring in a question from Mary, who wanted us to look at this through a DEI lens. Mary asks, can you talk a little about the sentencing inequities between white versus African American defendants that you covered in this podcast?
Yeah, it's that's really all thanks to the work of the researchers at Northeastern. That's really kind of the only way we're able to get any kind of sense about this. As we describe in the podcast, they do a search through an online database that tracks media mentions of death resulting cases, and they do kind of painstaking work of finding out the demographic information of each defendant in each case, and what they were charged with, and what they were ultimately sentenced with. And the sentencing disparity is significant, between Black defendants and white defendants charged with death resulting laws. And on one hand, it is saddeningly, maddeningly not a surprise within the kind of, given everything else we know about the criminal justice system and the way that human biases shape it and kind of warp it. And here it is at play again in kind of the most, or one of the most, serious drug charges we had. And, we didn't know about it until some researchers and graduate students and interns at Northeastern, did the work to find it out, because again, it's not something that the courts or prosecutors are tracking.
Do you know of any practical impact that data in particular has yielded? Have advocacy groups used that data to say, hey, these laws are disproportionately affecting people of color? Perhaps they should be rewritten or rethought. Has it had any practical effect?
Yes, Northeastern uses that data when in two ways. They, as I understand it, they will one, they reach out to defense attorneys who have these cases and provide them with this data as helpful information to cite if they have a defendant facing a death resulting case. They will write amicus briefs in cases. They did in Josh's case. Northeastern University did. They will also proactively reach out to prosecutors' offices and say, not in connection with a specific case, but say, hey, in general, like, this is what we're finding about death resulting laws. You guys should maybe take a second or third look at these cases before you decide to charge it, because these are the kind of disturbing trends that we're seeing. So that's the kind of efforts, as far as I know, that they've undertaken with that data.
Mm-hmm. Listeners, viewers, please do ask your questions if you've got them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Any question that occurs to you at all, please do ask. We'd love to bring your voice into the conversation. With respect to Josh, I want to talk about him a little bit, and perhaps the challenge of writing about him in the way that you did. You mentioned Josh's mother and how open she was. Were you trying to write a very empathetic view of him and his childhood when you started to introduce that subject? And how did you anticipate how the listener might feel at each twist and turn as you added more details about his life?
Yeah. What I wanted was a really honest portrait of Josh's and Shannon's life, and not in what I didn't want to do was kind of turn them into caricatures and make them sort of objects of pity or anything that would make them less less whole and complete and independent actors that they are. And it was a challenge, though, in terms of just creating a narrative with, how frankly difficult a lot of the story is. Josh's and Shannon's stories are both hard. They're really hard, and from it can seem like just sort of one, like a parade of one kind of difficult, wrenching event after another. And I worried a lot, and we as a team talked a lot about how to keep listeners engaged and wanting to know what's going to happen next. And at various times we thought about well, maybe we should cut this story or cut that anecdote, but ultimately all the things that stayed in were things that I felt like you really had to hear to get like a full sort of look at this case, at this situation. A kind of in my mind it was kind of like what in a perfect world we might be able to do for every criminal case ever, where if we had the time, or a judge or a jury really had the time to make an honest effort to truly understand a person who's been charged with whatever they've been charged with, and go back in time and find out what happened in their life and what led to this moment. And so that was, in a sense, that's what I was trying to do with Josh and Shannon, and have them, their experiences are such a vivid representation of so many things that we talk about in the news, or we cover in the news as having some kind of bearing on addiction or mental health. Or here's Josh, for instance, expelled from school, sent to juvenile detention, juvenile probation, adult incarceration, adult probation, and then finally
a heavy emphasis on punishment and not rehabilitation, it seemed.
In many ways it did. That's how it ended up. Yeah.
Because you do point out at the end that it took till now for him to have a judge say he needs some serious help, get him into a great drug treatment program. And he hadn't tried Suboxone, the opioid suppressor drug, until after this horrible event had happened.
Yeah.
You can't help but think, as you do in this podcast, what life would have been like for him and for Liz if he had access to that sooner.
Yeah. And that's exactly the kind of question that I hope that listeners come away with. Whether or not, what ultimately happens to Josh, in his sentence is justice or not. I felt and I feel like there are so many things that we can learn about, his experience, just kind of, pinballing through the system about the way we're dealing with addiction right now, in the state, in this country. And yeah, those are the kinds of questions I hope people have when they finish this.
Well, viewers, please do ask your questions using the Q&A button. We get this question from Peg, Jason. Peg wants to know, is death resulting used in New Hampshire frequently?
Well, it sort of depends. More frequently than it used to be. Yes, much more frequently than it used to be. If you look at the kind of the line graph for death resulting cases, it's sort of like this, and from 1980 until around 2009, 2010, it starts to go like this. And that's true both kind of that's true with federal cases in New Hampshire. It's also true with state cases, because there's New Hampshire has its own state version of death resulting law as well. The state version of the law does not have the same 15-year mandatory minimum, but it also does not have a maximum. And I've seen some death resulting cases, state cases in New Hampshire that have very, very long sentences. And of course, each case has its own set of facts and all that. But yeah, short answer to your question is yes, it's being used much more frequently than it used to be used. It's not terribly common in the scope of sort of all drug charges. I think it's safe to say it's pretty rare. as compared to, say, like simple drug possession. But it is what prosecutors have turned to for a response to the surge in fentanyl overdose deaths. And that's true in New Hampshire, and it's true in other states as well.
Jason, we get this question from Matthew. You may have answered this, but I just want to double check. Among those who are charged with death resulting, what percentage are dealers as opposed to friends? Matthew adds, I feel that is an important breakdown that is needed to review the effectiveness of the law as a punishment for the deaths.
That is a great question. I will have to look up the Northeastern data so I don't misquote them. I know it's in the story, but no, I don't have it in front of me. But the caveat was that the data is based on
stories that news reporters thought it was worth reporting on.
Thank you. Yes, and also the language that is used in those stories. I'm just pulling up the data right now. So if, for instance, there's a press release, from a district attorney's office, and they say, we've charged someone with death resulting today, so-and-so was the dealer, so-and-so was the victim, and then the local newspaper reprints that story, they get categorized as the dealer in Northeastern's database. The truth of that relationship may have been more complicated than that. If to my knowledge, there wasn't a press release written about Josh's case, but very easily they could have called him a dealer in her case. They were negotiating over a price at one point. So that's sort of a caveat to the data. But I wish I could find a number. My best recollection is about a third were folks that were described as caregivers, friends, family, sometimes significant others. And I think around half were described as dealers in these stories. Don't hold me to those exact numbers, but that was, I believe, about the rough breakdown. But again, with that caveat, that's sort of like, if the prosecutor calls them a dealer in the press release, that's probably what's going to get rewritten in the local news story, which is its own kind of sad commentary on the state of local news, but that's probably another Zoom event.
Right. Well, thank you for the question. Really appreciate it, and appreciate also having a chance to mention that the data that we do have is full of caveats. Hard to rely on it 100%. We had this question from an anonymous person here who says, I was blown away by the judge's role in this case. Judge LaPlante showed so much compassion. However, not every judge would make such a choice. Should justice rely on a judge's discretion? What does that say about our criminal justice system? So I'm not sure how much of a spoiler you are interested in giving. I wasn't going to give one, Jason. There are people there who still want to listen to this podcast to the end, but the question overall about the judge at the end showing compassion and the judges in general having so much discretion.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, because that's question of should judges have so much discretion is kind of the origin of mandatory minimums. In the 1980s and other times in American history, Congress has thought, wow, judges have too much discretion. They're giving people too lenient of a sentence. They're giving people too few years for what we think is a serious problem. So we're going to tie their hands and say, if they're convicted of XY crime, then they have to get 15 years. And then in some cases, that's how you end up with the kind of absurdity of some cases, on the other side of that, where maybe there are all these mitigating circumstances and reasonable people would all agree that they don't deserve, but technically they did, but it's a mandatory minimum, and the judge's hands are tied. So this gets back to that idea of discretion in the system, and why it is such a tricky, issue to sort out, because one day discretion is what you want. Another day, discretion is behind some really powerfully, systemic, for instance, a lot of racial bias in the court system. The way that gets in is through the discretion, on multiple levels, from a police officer. This person is trespassing, am I going to arrest them? Discretion. Am I going to charge, what am I going to write my police report with, right? What am I going to say they did? Discretion. The prosecutor, what am I going to charge them with? What kind of deal am I going to give them? The judge, am I going to accept this plea deal, or am I going to sentence them to the high end of the range or the low end of the range? All these layers of discretion, which there's powerful arguments for having. But on the other end, that's where a lot of the systemic bias and cultural opinions and racism and unconscious bias can seep into the system. So it's a kind of endlessly sort of interesting area of the law to me.
I wanted to ask you about your choice to interview Len Bias's mother for this podcast. You talk a little bit about in the podcast, but I'm wondering what the discussion was like in the writer's room as you were mulling whether to do it, and if she were to agree, what questions you would want to ask for her. Take us behind the scenes there. What was that conversation like in the room?
Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about that, and we wanted to be careful because we didn't want, and I believe we ended up writing some of this language into the podcast, but we didn't want to put her in the position of kind of being a stand-in for every every family member of every person who had died of a drug overdose, or for to kind of represent the impacts of drug policy on Black Americans. We didn't want to put that pressure on her as a single voice, because we'd be totally inappropriate. And so the question was, how do we do an interview with Lanice, and where does it go was also a big question. Does it go in episode 2? Jack, the executive producer for the series, had the great idea to put it in episode 4, because she really wrestles with the question, I think, in the same kind of way that a lot of listeners and people, sort of lay people, for lack of a better phrase, will, that it's complicated. It's not a simple matter, and I think, even though Lanice didn't have a really, strong opinion about, or definitive opinion about, all death resulting cases or no death resulting cases, kind of hearing her think through that, we thought added some kind of value to the story. And we thought it was important to have, someone who knew Len Bias in the story. We spent, the better part of an episode kind of talking about his history. We wanted to, acknowledge that he wasn't just a kind of a cultural icon or just a basketball player. He was a human. He was a human being with a mom and a brother. And to bring that into the story as well, particularly after doing that with Josh and Shannon. So yeah, it was a tough kind of situation at first, because I spoke with Lanice and she didn't have a kind of like I said, she didn't have a definitive opinion one way or the other about it, and I kind of puzzled over what to do with that. But I think in the end, as I said, we decided there was value in just kind of hearing her think through that, because we imagine that mirrored the process for people listening and trying to make up their own minds, when that was kind of the whole point of the series, was to put the question, to the listener and to try to make them do that same thing that Lindy's was doing.
I want to ask you a little bit about the writing process too, and what appeals to you about this long form of journalism. You did it so well in Bear Brook. You're doing it well here. What do you like so much about telling these long stories?
Well, I don't feel like I can like fully understand something until I spend this much time with it, which is it's not always something you can do with every idea or story or topic or issue. But when I think about the reasons that I wanted to get into audio journalism and public radio to begin with, it was these kinds of long stories that really introduce you to people in a real way and make you care about them, and through that mechanism not only learn so much, but care so much about other things that are important in this world. And so it's almost like if I haven't heard a podcast about it, or if I haven't read that long piece in the New Yorker about this issue, I'm not really ready to form an opinion about it yet. And so that's what drew me to public radio, to audio in the first place, was being able to hear people tell their own stories and being able to kind of feel like you were knowing them in a way that you obviously don't get from print, or I would argue even video or film documentaries. And spending that much time with someone, with a character in one of these, and getting to know them, I think it just changes how you think about the underlying material, the story, the subject. If you just heard Josh for 30 seconds, or if you just saw his name, versus I spent 2 hours like learning about his childhood and who he is. And as long as I can make that interesting for you, and a compelling narrative that keeps your attention the whole time, then it's no question for me which one is more valuable as a thing for me to produce as a journalist.
How did writing Death Resulting and reporting Death Resulting differ from your reporting and writing Bear Brook? Are there major differences?
That's a good question. It was different in that there was a lot more, we had to do a lot more writing in Death Resulting about kind of why we were doing the project, what we were up to, what we were hoping to get from it, where those are all kind of, one of the kind of allures and the power of true crime is that you don't ever actually have to answer those questions. It's sort of assumed, implied from the get. Like, we want to find out who the victims are. Like, no one needs to explain that. With Bear Brook, with Death Resulting, it's like, here's a drug case that's like, it's not like totally unique in the span of things. It's the outcome is really, it's a matter of degrees. How much is he going to get sentenced to? It's not the kind of biggest sort of cliffhanger that you're kind of building to, and so it was harder. It was harder to write this story, to get across why we thought it was important, why we thought it was worth you sticking around for. But that's really hard to do, because as soon as I start saying like, this is why this story is good, that's usually when as a listener, I'm starting to reach for the dial, because if you're having to like explain it to me, it's like a joke, right? If you're explaining it to me, you're not doing it well. So that was a challenge for sure with this story, along with how frankly difficult it is to listen to at times. I mean, starting the opening scene, the opening anecdote of the podcast, and Liz's overdose is that's really hard. I mean, it's really hard to listen to. It still affects me. It's affecting me right now, just like thinking about that tape. And Josh, describing it. And we had a lot of discussion about, can we start the story there? Are we going to lose people right away, with such a heavy anecdote? And, ultimately we decided that, this is what the story is about, and if people, if that's too much, that's understandable, it's fine, but this is what we're doing a story about. And so we have to we can't pull that punch, we have to get right into it. So yeah, that was its own challenge as well.
We got this question from Sarah, who asks, it's a two-parter. We'll start with the first part. What was the response from Josh's family to the series?
Positive, generally positive. I've been in touch with Shannon since we released it. Happy to report she's still doing well. And I think for both Shannon and Josh, there was a kind of understandable anxiety and nervousness about, what I was going to do with the story and kind of what they were going to be, how they were going to be portrayed. I mean, they shared some very, very personal stuff about their life with me, and they trusted me with that. And that was, that was a big responsibility and something I wanted to take seriously. And so, I was pleased to hear that they both, Shannon and Josh both felt like, we didn't take advantage of their stories. So yeah, that's the short of it. Yeah, they're positive so far.
And the second part of Sarah's question was, did Josh's attorney get the desired response from the exposure of death resulting laws? Did you ever hear anything else from him after the series was released?
Yeah, we did talk about, the outcome of the case, and he did, Murat did say that he, was grateful that we did the series and enjoyed it. Did it do what he wanted it to? I don't know. I mean, I think part of what Murat wanted, I don't know if he would say this or would have said it to me, but part of what he was probably thinking as a defense attorney was that it would be helpful to have a reporter in the room when the judge is sentencing my client, because it's a subtle reminder that, the public is watching, and that, that could, maybe put a thumb on this, on the scale for Josh. And, as a defense attorney, he's trying to do what's best for his client. I understood that. But in the broader sense of, bringing it, awareness to the fact that these laws are out there and are getting used more and more often, I don't know. I don't know if it's hard to know if we've achieved that, or yeah, we'll have to see if anything, if there's any more discussion around these prosecutions, whether in New Hampshire or elsewhere. But in that way, I think, Murat and my objectives were at least similar, if not the same. I thought people should know about these prosecutions, and I think that's why, at least part of why Murat reached out to us in the first place.
We get this question from an anonymous attendee. I've heard that Jason composed some of the music for the show. Can you talk about that process? I think it's not just some, it's all of the music.
Yes. Yeah, all the music in Death Resulting is original. It's, something that we started when we were working on Bear Brook. And it's honestly, it's sort of a personal kind of pet peeve of mine, I guess I'd say, that as podcasting has grown, and these kinds of narrative series are proliferating everywhere, there's the kind of seemingly same set of music beds that people use. And so
the free music archive things. Yeah.
Yes. So hearing the same music in different, and it just feels to me that you wouldn't see that in a like I don't know, in a AAA, film documentary, or like you don't see in New Yorker articles, long form New Yorker articles, like using the same stock photo as another magazine. So it just felt to me like, if podcasts are to be taken, seriously as a medium, we gotta all stop using the same damn music. Was sort of
well, how nice too that you can custom make your. So you're playing guitar, you're playing piano. Is there another instrument I'm missing?
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah,
Guitar,
keyboard, guitar, and yeah, some software in there to help stretch notes out and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's just something I do. I usually, I'm not writing like particular music for a particular piece. I'm just writing and recording things periodically and kind of building a small library so that when we're ready to start mixing, producing something, we have stuff to pull from. And then occasionally I will, we're missing some kind of mood for a series, then I might try to do that. But yeah, that's how we do it.
Yeah. Well, let me close with this one. What are you hoping listeners of Document Death Resulting will take away from this latest season?
On a very basic level, I just, I hope that people are aware that these laws are out there, that they're getting used more and more frequently. And I hope it just makes people think about whether that's what we want to be happening. One thing I didn't mention that drew me to the story was how at odds it seems with the kind of prevailing rhetoric out there right now around the opioid crisis and addiction today. People, elected officials especially love to say that we cannot arrest our way out of this crisis, and there's a lot.
What they were saying in the 80s.
That's not what they're right. There's not what they're saying in the 80s. There's a lot to be said about that and the racial undertones of that difference. But it's also in many ways not what's happening, so I just, I hope it's a dose of reality about the kind of the state of the war on drugs, the continuing war on drugs that is very much still happening today. This is one small part of what it looks like, despite what may sound like, or what may seem like a kind of softer, more gentle approach to problem drug use. For a lot of people, this is the reality right now.
Well, Jason Moon, thank you so much for answering our questions about Document Death Resulting, where you can find it wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't heard it yet. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming to this.
And thanks to the Document team as well. It takes a village to put something like this together,
Yes,
I imagine.
absolutely.
Great. Well, everybody, have a great night.